Welcome back to the Conviction Fiction Podcast. Now, if you're new here, let me tell you what this platform is about. This podcast exists because there's a story society loves to tell. It's the story of the criminal, the convict, the inmate, the felon, gang member, the statistic, all those things related to prisoners. But what society rarely talks about is the chapter before the arrest, the chapter before the prison sentence, the chapter before the courtroom, the chapter before the obituary. That chapter is often youth violence. At the Conviction Fiction Podcast, our mission is simple. We expose the fiction that people are beyond redemption while simultaneously confronting the choices that put people on destructive paths in the first place. Because every incarcerated adult was once a child. Every prison sentence has a beginning. Every life lost to violence has a story. And if we truly want to change the narrative of incarceration, reentry, and generational trauma, then we must be willing to discuss the pipeline that feeds the prison system long before young people ever step foot inside a jail cell. I know this because I lived it. I spent 15 years incarcerated. I know what it means to make decisions that forever alter lives. I know what happens when anger becomes identity. I also know what happens when pain becomes violence. I know this because I lived it. And today's conversation is not about judging young people, it's about saving them. Because youth violence isn't just a public safety issue. It's a prison pipeline issue. It's a family issue. It's a community issue. And ultimately, it's a human issue. Let's go ahead and get started into the conviction fiction. One of the reasons I created a conviction fiction podcast is because society has become obsessed with the ending of people's stories while completely ignoring the beginning. We see the mugshot, we see the arrest, we see the courtrooms. We've been in courtrooms, we witness prison sentences, we see the obituaries, but we rarely stop and ask a simple question: how did we get here? How did a child become a statistic? How did a teenager become a defendant? How did a young person become another face on the evening news? The truth is that prison stories don't start in prison. They start years before the handcuffs. They start years before the indictment. They start years before the judge bangs the gavel. Every prison story starts somewhere. For some, it starts in a home filled with violence. For others, it starts with abandonment. For some, it starts with bullying. And even others, it starts with poverty. For some children, it begins with trauma they never asked for and never learned how to process. The challenge is that society tends to pay attention only after the explosion. Nobody pays attention to the pressure building inside the container. Nobody notices the warning signs or notices the child who suddenly becomes withdrawn. Nobody notices the teenager who is desperately seeking acceptance. And more often than not, nobody notices the young man who has convinced himself that anger is strength because nobody ever taught him another way to survive. I know this because I lived it. I wasn't born wanting to spend 15 years incarcerated. Nobody wakes up in elementary school and says, I hope I could become a convicted felon someday. Nobody dreams of prison cells or court dates or losing decades of their lives. Yet every day we continue acting as if these outcomes happen in isolation, as if people simply wake up one morning and decide to throw their lives away. That's fiction. And exposing that fiction is exactly why this podcast exists. The reality is that destructive choices often begin as survival mechanisms. A young person feels powerless, so they seek power. A young person feels invisible, so they look for attention. Another young person may feel rejected, so they seek belonging. Unfortunately, the first people willing to provide those things are not always the people who genuinely care about them. Sometimes it's the gang. Sometimes it's the neighborhood crew. Sometimes it's older individuals who recognize vulnerability and exploit it. Sometimes it's social media with the influencers who glamorize destruction. Sometimes it's an environment that teaches violence as a solution before teaching communication as a skill. What makes this conversation difficult is that people want simple answers. They want one villain, one cause, one explanation. But youth violence is rarely that simple. It's often the result of layers upon layers of pain, disappointment, neglect, trauma, poor decision making, and environmental influences stacking on top of each other until eventually something breaks. The young man or woman carrying a gun today may have been the little boy or the little girl who needed a mentor 5 years ago. The teenager getting arrested today may have been the child crying for help that nobody noticed. The person standing before a judge tomorrow may have been the student who quietly lost hope years earlier. That doesn't excuse harmful behavior. Let me be clear. Personal responsibility matters. Accountability matters. Victims matters. Consequences matter. But if we only focus on punishment and never examine the path that led someone there, then we will continue producing more tragedies than solutions. At the Conviction Fiction Podcast, we believe in accountability. We believe in ownership. We believe people must face the consequences of their actions. But we also believe that prevention is better than punishment. What if we invested as much energy into saving children as we do incarcerating adults? What if communities became proactive instead of reactive? What if we recognized warning signs before they became criminal records? Because every prison sentence starts with a story. Every violent act starts with a choice. And every choice is influenced by experiences that began long before society started paying attention. If we truly want to reduce youth violence, then we have to stop focusing exclusively on the outcome and start addressing the origin. Because prison is not where the story begins, it's where society finally notices it. Now, one thing I've learned through my own life, through prison, through reentry, through mentoring, through coaching youth baseball, and through hosting this podcast is that every human being is searching for an identity. Every one of us wants to know who we are. We want to know where we belong. We want to know that we matter. We want to know that our lives have purpose. The problem is that young people often begin asking those questions long before they're mature enough to answer them. And if healthy influences don't help shape those answers, unhealthy influences will gladly step in and do it for them. That's one of the greatest dangers facing our youth today because nature hates a vacuum. If a father isn't present, something else will fill that void. If a mentor isn't present, something else will fill that void. If positive leadership isn't present, guess what? Someone or something will come in to fill that void. The question isn't whether young people will be influenced. The question is who will influence them first. I often hear people say, why would a kid join a gang? Why would you want to be in a gang? But that's the wrong question. The better question is, what was the gang offering that the community wasn't offering? Think about it. A young person may want respect. The gang offers respect. A young person wants belonging. The gang offers belonging, protection, recognition. Now, understand something. None of those things are inherently bad. Wanting respect isn't bad. Wanting acceptance isn't bad. Wanting community isn't a bad thing. Those are normal human desires. The tragedy is that many young people find those needs fulfilled in destructive environments instead of healthy ones. When I look at my own journey, when I look back, I can clearly see moments where I was searching for identity. I wanted to prove something. I wanted to matter. I wanted respect. I wanted to feel significant. And when you combine youthful pride with poor decision making and limited guidance, you create the perfect conditions for disaster. That's why youth violence isn't always about violence. Sometimes it's about identity. It's about belonging. Sometimes it's about a young person trying desperately to become somebody without understanding who they truly are. Social media has only amplified this problem. Young people today are constantly comparing themselves to people they never even met. They're measuring their worth through likes, through followers, or views, or comments. They're consuming content that often glorifies money, power, aggression, and status, while rarely showing the consequences that come with chasing those things in the wrong way. The internet tells them to be feared. It tells them to dominate. It tells them that weakness is unacceptable. The internet tells them that respect must be demanded instead of earned. Then we wonder why conflicts escalate so quickly, because many young people have attached their identity to their reputation. And when your identity is tied to your reputation, every insult feels like an attack on your existence. Every disagreement will feel personal. Every challenge becomes a threat to you. That's how small arguments become shootings. That's how hurt feelings become violence. That's how pride destroys futures. One of the reasons I coach youth sports is because sports create opportunities to teach identity differently. On a baseball field, I don't care how many followers a kid has. I don't care what shoes he's wearing. I don't care what neighborhood he comes from. I care about effort, discipline, teamwork. I care about their character. I care about how they respond when things don't go their way, because those are qualities that actually determine success in life, not social status, not fear, not intimidation, character. The reality is that many young people are trying to answer adult questions with childhood mentalities. They're searching for meaning, searching for purpose, searching for direction. And far too often, the loudest voices in their lives are the least qualified to guide them. This is why mentorship matters. This is why fathers matters. This is why coaches matters. This is why teachers matter. This is why community leaders matter. And this is why podcasts like the Conviction Fiction that you're listening to, why they matter. Because if we don't help young people discover who they are, someone else will tell them who they should be. And that voice may lead them directly towards violence, incarceration, addiction, or even death. One of the core messages behind my books, got the first book, The Conviction Fiction, No Turning Back and Turning Forward, is that identity determines direction. People rarely rise above the image they have of themselves. If a young person sees himself as a criminal, he'll eventually behave like one. If he sees himself as hopeless, he'll make hopeless decisions. If he sees himself as a victim, he'll live like a victim. But if he sees himself as a leader, if he sees himself as a father, if he sees himself as an entrepreneur, if he sees himself as a student, even if he sees himself as someone capable of greatness, everything changes. That's why the battle against youth violence is ultimately a battle for identity. Because before a young person picks up a weapon, joins a gang, or commits a crime, or throws away their entire future, they first believe a story about who they are. And if we're going to change the outcome, we must first help them change the story. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions about violence is that people believe the consequences end when the police arrive. They think the story ends with the arrest. They think justice is served when the sentence is handed down. They even think that accountability begins after they leave the courtroom. But if you've lived this life, if you've experienced incarceration from the inside, if you sat across from families devastated by violence, or listened to mothers cry, children ask impossible questions, and fathers disappear behind prison walls, you understand something most people will never see. The sentence doesn't stop with the person convicted. The sentence spreads. It spreads through families. It spreads through entire communities. It spreads through generations. And that's why I say violence creates generational prison sentences. The judge may sentence one person, but everyone around them pays a price. When I was incarcerated, I learned a painful truth that took years for me to fully understand. I wasn't the only one serving time. My family was serving time too. Not in a prison cell, not behind razor wire or under constant supervision, but they were carrying the sentence all the same. Birthdays were missed, graduations were missed, holidays were missed, family memories were created without me. Um, Children grew up, parents grew older. Life continues moving forward, and the people you love are forced to adapt to your absence. The consequences of violence don't stop with the individual, they ripple outward. And that's exactly why youth violence matters so much. Because when a teenager picks up a weapon, they're not just gambling with their own future. They're gambling with the futures they haven't even created yet: future spouses, future children, opportunities, future generations. A single decision made in anger can create consequences that last for decades. Think about how many children are growing up today with a parent who is incarcerated. Think about how many young people are navigating life without consistent guidance because someone made a decision years ago that changed everything. Think about how many families are still carrying the emotional weight of violence that happened long before some of their children were even born. That's generational trauma. And generational trauma doesn't simply disappear because time passes, it gets inherited, it gets passed down, sometimes through behavior, sometimes through fear, sometimes through silence. A young person watches violence become normalized and begins believing violence is normal. A child can grow up around chaos and just automatically expect chaos wherever they go. A teenager sees incarceration happen repeatedly within their family and begins believing prison is simply part of life, not because they're bad people, but because repeated exposure shapes expectations. The cycle continues generation after generation. And this podcast exists because I refuse to accept the idea that these cycles are inevitable. We can change the narrative. I refuse to believe that incarceration has to become a family tradition. I refuse to believe that violence has to be inherited like it's an heirloom. I refuse to believe that a young person's future should be determined by the mistakes of the people who came before them. Because I've seen transformation happen. I've seen people break cycles. I've seen men leave prison and become fathers. I've seen women overcome impossible circumstances and build stable lives. I've seen individuals who were once written off become business owners or community leaders and even mentors and advocates. The cycle can be broken, but first we have to acknowledge that it exists. The reality is that every act of violence creates victims beyond the obvious ones. There's the victim of the crime first, right? Then we have the family of the victim. There's the person who committed the act. There's the family of the offender. There are children affected on both sides. There are entire communities affected on both sides. Everyone loses. That's why revenge is such a dangerous trap. People often believe violence solves violence, but violence rarely ends a conflict. It usually expands it. One shooting can create another or retaliation against another. One generation's trauma becomes the next generation's burden. And before long, people can't even remember what started the conflict in the first place. They only know they're carrying pain that was handed to them. This is why prevention matters so much. Every young person we steer away from violence isn't just one life saved, it's potentially multiple generations changed if you think about it. Every teenager who chooses purpose over destruction creates a different future for their children. Every young person who avoids incarceration changes the trajectory of an entire family tree. Every child who learns conflict resolution instead of retaliation creates a legacy different from the one that they inherited. That is why this conversation is bigger than crime statistics. It's bigger than politics, headlines, or any of that stuff. We're talking about the future. We're talking about whether our children inherit hope or inherit trauma, whether they inherit opportunity or incarceration. whether they inherit purpose or pain. And if you've been listening to the Conviction Fiction podcast for any length of time, then you already know what I believe. I believe people can change. I believe cycles can be broken. I believe accountability and redemption can coexist. I believe your past can explain you without defining you. And I believe the greatest way to reduce incarceration tomorrow is to prevent youth violence today. Because every generation deserves the opportunity to inherit something better than the pain that came before it. And it's our responsibility to make sure they do. Now, one of the reasons conversations about youth violence become so polarized is because people tend to fall into one of two extremes. Either they're on the side that wants accountability without compassion, or they're on the side that wants compassion without accountability. One side says, man, like lock them up, throw away the key. And the other side says, they're just kids. They need a, chance. Now, somewhere in the middle, the truth gets lost because the truth is that accountability and compassion are not enemies. They're partners. In fact, when separated from one another, both become dangerous. Accountability without compassion creates hopelessness. Now, compassion without accountability creates excuses. And if we're serious about addressing youth violence, we have to stop choosing one over the other. We actually need both. Now, this is where I know some people get, a little uneasy, or I might lose some people right here. Because when we talk about youth violence, there are real victims. There are families that have buried children. There are parents who have had to identify loved ones. There are communities carrying scars from acts of violence that can never be undone. We must never minimize that reality. Actions have consequences. Choices matter. Personal responsibility matters. Victims matter. The pain caused by violence is real, and there's no other reality that is equally true. A young person who commits a harmful act is still a human being, and that's where many conversations break down. The moment someone commits a crime, society often stops seeing that person and starts seeing a label: criminal, thug, heathen, gang member, inmate, convict, a problem, animal, a threat, a beast. And while labels may describe behavior, they do not fully define a human being. Trust me, I know. I spent over 15 years locked up, and I know exactly what it feels like to be reduced to the worst decision you ever made. I know what it's like to have people assume your story is already finished. I know what it's like to have society decide who you are before you've even had the chance to become who you're capable of being. That experience shaped much of what I do with the podcast and what I do with my books. Because one of the greatest lies society tells is that people are either all good or that they're all bad. Life doesn't work that way. Human beings don't work that way. No one's perfect. People are capable of causing harm. I don't care if you grew up in an affluent neighborhood or if you grew up in the ghettos of America. People are capable of causing harm. People are capable of growth. Both can be true at the same time. The challenge is that our culture often struggles to hold those truths together. We either excuse behavior entirely or condemn people permanently. Neither approach creates transformation, and neither approach has worked individually. Let's be honest. Some people need intervention. Some young people do need intervention. Some young people need consequences. They need structure. They need boundaries. Some of them need to hear no. Some of them need to understand that certain decisions carry life altering repercussions. That's accountability. But accountability should never be confused with abandonment. And that's where systems sometimes fail. Too often we punish without teaching, we condemn without mentoring, or we isolate without rehabilitating. We criticize. Very often we criticize without offering guidance. Then we act surprised when the behavior continues. What exactly are we expecting? Growth requires more than punishment. Growth requires responsibility. It requires reflection. Growth requires opportunities to become something different. One of the central messages in my book is that, in all of the books, is that accountability is not about destroying people. It's about confronting reality. It's about looking in the mirror and accepting ownership for your choices. But ownership is only the first step. The next step is transformation. That's where many people get lost or they get stuck. They acknowledge their mistakes, but never learn how to move beyond them. And that's why I wrote No Turning Back. That book challenges readers to stop living passively and start taking responsibility for the direction of their lives day by day. Because growth doesn't happen by accident. Transformation doesn't happen because we wish for it or we pray for it. It happens because we choose it. Now, I'm not saying that prayer doesn't work. I do believe in a higher power, but the higher power of your choice would not want you to just want him or her or whoever you believe in to take care of everything. You have to make consistent actions towards your goal every single day, one decision at a time. And that message is especially important for the young people because many teenagers believe one mistake defines their future forever. Many think that one arrest, that their life is over, and they get more arrests, they get more suspensions, more failures, more bad decisions, just because they believe that they have failed. And while consequences are real, hopelessness is a lie. A mistake can become a lesson. A setback can become a turning point. A failure can become the foundation of future success, but only if someone teaches them how to change the narrative. That's where compassion enters the conversation. Compassion says, you're responsible for what you did, but you are capable of becoming more than what you did. Compassion doesn't remove consequences. It creates opportunities for redemption. Compassion doesn't erase accountability. It gives accountability a purpose. And that purpose is growth. Because what good is accountability if it doesn't produce change? What good is it to have punishment if it doesn't create understanding that I shouldn't do that anymore? Right? What good is correction if it doesn't lead to transformation? When I think about youth violence, I don't just think about stopping bad behavior. I think about creating better futures. I think about helping young people become the men and women they were created to be. About breaking the cycle before they even become life sentences. I think about preventing another young person from walking the same road I walked. Because while I believe deeply in accountability, I also believe deeply in redemption. Those are not opposites. They are inseparable. And we truly want to reduce youth violence, then we must be willing to hold young people accountable while simultaneously refusing to give up on them. Because every child deserves correction. Every child needs guidance. Every child needs consequences when necessary. But every child also deserves hope. And hope is often the very thing that prevents violence from becoming a lifelong identity. That's why this platform exists. Not to excuse harmful behavior, not to ignore consequences, but to remind people that accountability may explain where growth begins, yet redemption is what determines where the story goes next. Now, as we close the conversation, I want to challenge something I heard my entire life. Whenever youth violence becomes a topic of discussion, people immediately start looking for someone to blame. Parents blame the schools, schools blame the parents, communities blame politicians, politicians blame communities, churches blame culture, culture blames social media. Everyone pointing the finger, everyone identifying the problem, everyone finds someone else responsible. Meanwhile, that doesn't change the fact that another young life is lost. Another family is shattered. Another teenager enters the criminal justice system. Another child grows up believing violence is normal. And the cycle continues and continues. That's why I believe one of the most dangerous phrases in America is somebody needs to do something. Because whenever we say somebody needs to do something, we usually mean somebody else. Somebody else should mentor. Somebody else should coach. Somebody else should volunteer. Somebody else should invest in the community or reach these kids. Somebody else should solve the problem. Whenever we say somebody needs to do something about it, the reality is that changes begin when we stop waiting for somebody else. The mission of this platform has never been to simply tell stories. We tell stories on here, but it's not the primary focus. It's never been about entertainment or money or about collecting views, downloads, or subscribers. The mission has always been to change the narrative, to challenge the fiction that people are disposable, to challenge the fiction that incarceration is the end of someone's story, to challenge the fiction that cycles of violence are unavoidable. And most importantly, the purpose of this platform has always been to challenge the fiction that we are all powerless to make a difference because we are not powerless. The truth is that most young people don't need a superhero. They need consistency. They need presence. They need someone who shows up, someone who listens, someone who cares, someone who believes in them when they haven't learned to yet how to believe in themselves. Throughout my entire journey, I've learned that transformation rarely happens because of one dramatic moment. It usually happens because of repeated exposure to positive influences, a coach who refuses to give up, a teacher who sees potential, a mentor who tells the truth, a parent who remains present, a pastor who continues to reach out, a community that decides his children are worth fighting for. That's how lives change, not through one grand gesture, not through um, some miraculous um, God said thing. It's not through one thing. It's through consistent investment. And that's why I spend so much time coaching you baseball. I'm telling you, I'm there damn 5 days a week. People sometimes think we're just teaching our kids how to throw a baseball when we're not. We're teaching discipline. We're teaching accountability. We're teaching teamwork. We're teaching resilience. We're teaching them how to respond when things don't go their way. We're teaching life. Every practice is bigger than baseball. Every conversation is bigger than baseball. Every lesson is bigger than baseball. Because one day the game is going to end. And the question is whether the lessons remain. The same principle applies to every young person in every community. They are watching us. They are learning from us. They're paying attention even when we think they aren't. The culture we create today becomes the future they inherit tomorrow. That's why youth violence is not just a youth problem. It's an adult responsibility. Young people are often reflecting what they've observed, experienced, and learned from the world around them. And if we want better outcomes, we must provide better examples. If we want stronger communities, we must provide um, stronger communities. We must become stronger. If we want young people to value life, then we must demonstrate that their lives have value. And let me speak directly to any young person listening right now. Maybe you're angry, maybe you're carrying pain. I get it. Maybe you feel misunderstood. Maybe you're tired of being overlooked. Maybe you've convinced yourself that violence is the only way people will respect you. I need you to hear me. I've lived the consequences. I've sat in prison cells. I've watched years disappear. I watched opportunities vanish. I watched families suffer. I watched people spend decades trying to recover from decisions that took only seconds to make. I left people that are still in prison. There's nothing glamorous about that life. Nothing. The streets will sell you a dream and leave you with a nightmare. The streets will promise loyalty and then disappear when consequences arrive. They'll celebrate your recklessness and abandon you when the bill comes due. Do not confuse attention for respect, young people. Do not confuse fear for power or confuse survival with purpose. You were created for more than that. Your future is worth protecting. Your life is worth protecting. Your purpose is worth protecting. And that's why this conversation matters. That's why this platform exists. That's why I write the books. That's why I wrote No Turning Back and No Turning Forward. Because I believe people need more than inspiration. They need tools. They need truth. They need guidance. They need example of what transformation actually looks like. The conviction fiction teaches readers about the realities of incarceration, accountability, and more importantly, redemption. We want to challenge people to stop living passively and start taking ownership of their lives, right? And that's why I tried to write those books because it provides those practical steps for building a future that isn't controlled by what you've done. All of my books are built on the same foundational belief. Your worst decision does not have to become your permanent identity. And that's the message I want every young person to hear today. The world may try to define you by your mistakes. Your neighborhood may try to define you by its limitations, or the circumstances you're in may try to define you by your struggle. But your future is not determined by where you started. It's determined by the choices you make next. That's the heart of redemption. That's the heart of accountability. That's the heart of transformation. And that's the heart of the Conviction Fiction podcast. Changing the narrative, breaking generational cycles, restoring hope, and reminding people everywhere that while your past may explain part of your story, it never has to write the ending. Until the next time, stay safe, stay focused, stay accountable, and keep moving forward because somebody has to change the narrative. Why not let it be you, right? But before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought. There's a lot of headlines out there about youth violence, about but that conversation that never happened, the mentor who never showed up. If you that person, man, go mentor, right? If you see a child that's hurting in silence or a young person searching for identity in all the wrong places, you got to realize that if we're going to change the future, we can't wait until the police arrive. You can't wait till the courtroom fill up or you see another news story or the funeral begins. We have to get involved while there's still time to make a difference, right? If you listen to the podcast, we're not just talking about incarceration, but preventing the next generation from ever having an experience. So if it challenged you, inspired you, or made you think differently, share it with somebody who needs to hear it. And if you're looking for more tools to help you navigate accountability, purpose, and all that stuff, man, like check out the books. They're available online. You can reach out to me directly. I get you a copy for free. Remember, violence isn't about a choice. It's also about purpose. Destruction is a choice, but so is transformation. Your past may explain your story, but it never has to write your ending. This is Antoine Rivers, and you've been listening to the Conviction Fiction podcast. Until next time, stay accountable, stay focused, and keep moving forward. Peace.